On its release in 1959, Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers was met with considerable criticism, most of which centered around the accusations of glorifying the military, being anti-democratic, and promoting fascism. Heinlein himself accepted the first in Expanded Universe, responding to the unattributed accusation that this book glorifies the military. He responds, "Now we are getting somewhere. It does indeed, especially the PBI." If you're a layman like me, you may not be aware that PBI stands for Poor Bloody Infantry. The accusations of being anti-democratic, equally unattributed, meet with scorn rather than outright denial. The Founding Fathers never intended the franchise to be extended to everyone. Their early discussions and laws show it. And democracies tend to collapse not too long after the plebs discover they can vote themselves bread and circuses. For a while. Heinlein does not address accusations of fascism in Expanded Universe, nor in the collection of his correspondence called Grumbles from the Grave. However, Learning Curve, the authorized biography by William Patterson, includes the following quote on communism, which indicates an antipathy to both forms of government. "I regard it as red fascism, distinguishable from black and brown fascism by differences of no importance to me or its victims." However, people and politics do change, and this quote from 1949 does not necessarily reflect his attitudes 10 years later when Starship Troopers was released. To address accusations of fascism requires a workable definition of the term, which is not necessarily as simple as it might seem. For example, the OED online offers an authoritarian and nationalist right-wing system of government and social organisation, extreme authoritarian, oppressive or intolerant views or practices. Whereas my printed copy of the same from 2001 offers only an authoritarian and nationalist right-wing system of government and social organisation, suggesting some shift in meaning over time. Dictionary.com offers a more detailed definition: a governmental system led by a dictator having complete power, forcibly suppressing opposition and criticism, regimenting all industry, commerce, etc., and emphasising an aggressive nationalism and often racism. This definition is very similar to the one found on Merriam-Webster.com, which reads, "A political philosophy, movement or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, and it stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition." So only 1 out of 3, the OED, describes fascism as a particularly right-wing phenomenon. Dictionary.com describes policies such as regimenting all industry, commerce, etc., which Merriam-Webster concurs with severe economic and social regimentation, which is clearly the opposite of the policies of most right-leaning political parties. Dictionary.com also offers aggressive nationalism, matching Merriam-Webster's exalts nation, which is equally unlikely to be found in many left-wing manifestos. One of the world's more infamous fascists, Adolf Hitler, explained the makeup of fascism. From the camp of bourgeois tradition, it takes national resolve, and from the materialism of the Marxist dogma, living creative socialism. So it's worth dismissing the idea of left or right, and instead taking the 2 more detailed definitions from Dictionary.com and Merriam-Webster to consider the following as an acceptable definition of fascism. 1. Government headed by a dictatorial leader. 2. Society as more important than the individual. 3. Strongly nationalist, often with underpinnings of racial superiority. 4. Economic, commercial and social regimentation. 5. Forcible suppression of opposition. The easiest of these to confirm or deny is number 1. The Terran Federation of the novel is an elected government. While franchise is limited to those who serve, service is voluntary, and given that all the protagonists of the novels are ultimately there to secure their right to vote, it is clear that elections do happen within that system. The only suggestion of an overall leader is the Sky Marshal-in-Chief, but that seems to be the head of the military rather than the society, and there's no suggestion of a dictator or any other kind of overall leader of the human society described in the book. Instead, it is the enemy, the Arachnid society, that is described as the ultimate dictatorship of the hive. Naturally, the limiting of the franchise, often the subject of the criticisms of the book as undemocratic, could easily be corrupted for fascistic ends. Many despots in human history, including Hitler and Mugabe for example, have chosen similar paths to interfere with democratic processes, such as banning opposition parties, while others have outlawed voting altogether. A limited franchise is actually present in every current democracy. In the text, there is opposition to these limitations, usually in terms of age, from Major Reed, who says, "I have never been able to see how a 30-year-old moron can vote more wisely than a 15-year-old genius." The system proposed in Starship Troopers is fairly complicated. To be able to vote, an individual must have served the Federation in some capacity. As the recruiting officer explains to Rico, service is not a privilege for some, but a right to all. But if you want to serve and I can't talk you out of it, then we have to take you, because that's your constitutional right. The civil service makes up 95% of the jobs available to volunteers, and the military just 5%. However, the volunteers cannot choose which branch of the service they will take. Instead, their roles are allocated according to a list of preferences they submit, but mostly on the basis of 4 days of aptitude tests. In Starship Troopers, Carmen's skill with mathematics sees her assigned to serve in the Navy, her first choice. Rico's lack of capability with figures excludes him from most of his choices, and his inability to persuade his mother to let him keep a dog in the house sees him miss out on the next. He is allocated his last choice, the mobile infantry. While service is a nominal 2 years, the Federation reserves the right to extend it, indefinitely if required. So again, we see an opportunity for corruption, theoretically burying opponents in the system until they die, or actively assigning them to roles with higher mortality rates. This is not a death sentence, however, since a volunteer can resign without achieving franchise at any point while not actively engaged in combat. Society being more important than the individual is a much less straightforward issue in Starship Troopers. Despite the insistence that 95% of Federation jobs are non-military, Major Reed insists that all voters in the society have demonstrated through voluntary and difficult service that he places the welfare of the group above that of personal advantage. Despite that, Heinlein is known to be fiercely individualist, as demonstrated in earlier works such as The Puppet Masters, in which human agents fight off an alien collective. There are parallels here as well, as the Arachnid society is described as a total communism. Certainly the conflict between the mobile infantry and the Arachnids can be seen as an opposition of collectives. However, the difference is largely that the Arachnids are born into the servitude, whereas a human first has to volunteer for service and then prove his aptitude for his given role. Ultimately, a volunteer, but especially a soldier, is expected to give themselves to the service of the Federation, potentially via a lifetime of service, or in the case of many of Rico's colleagues, by being killed in action. Point 3. Strongly nationalist, often with underpinnings of racial superiority. Firstly, any suggestions of racism can be largely dismissed. Rico is himself of Latin descent, and the Terran Federation explicitly welcomes volunteers unlimited by race, colour, creed, birth, wealth, sex, or conviction, which we see in the constitution of Rico's various units. Nor are the ultimate enemy, the Arachnids, portrayed as inferior. Quite the opposite, in fact. Humanity relies on its technology, particularly the powered armour of the mobile infantry, to level the playing field. There are certain things in the novel that might be seen today by some as slightly problematic. For example, women are excluded from serving in the mobile infantry, but not from any other role, and very minor racial stereotypes such as the Asian recruit Shizumi being a martial arts expert. But Shizumi is not portrayed negatively, and in 1959 this multiculturalism would probably have been quite progressive. However, despite the multicultural flavour of the Federation, the nationalist verve is undeniable. Heinlein was actually writing Stranger in a Strange Land when in 1958 the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy ran a full-page advert in his local newspaper calling for an end to nuclear testing. Heinlein, whose anti-communist stance had apparently not softened over the years, immediately began a counter-campaign that recalled Patrick Henry's famous proclamation, "Give me liberty or give me death," but ultimately came to nothing. The spiritual inertia exerted on Rico by the radiation-free paradise of the planet's sanctuary stands in for this. Rico is almost happy to settle there despite knowing that the local circumstances would leave his descendants unable to evolve at the same rate as the rest of humanity. Incensed by the same group's lack of patriotism, Heinlein would interrupt writing Stranger in favour of Starship Troopers. So Troopers can definitely be seen as a reaction to the trusting fools and poltroons duped by the rankest sort of communist propaganda, and an attempt to whip up a little nationalist fervour. Despite the attempts at multiculturalism, the text is undeniably and understandably Americentric, and the military and social critique offered by characters like Colonel Dubois and Major Reed, coupled with phrases like those following, combine to give this novel a distinctly jingoistic flavour. Nevertheless, let us assume that the human race manages to balance birth and death just right to fit its own planets and thereby becomes peaceful. What happens? Soon, about next Wednesday, the bugs move in, kill off this breed which ain't a-gonna study war no more, and the universe forgets us. Either we spread and wipe out the bugs, or they spread and wipe us out, because both races are tough and smart and want the same real estate. Point 4. Economic, commercial and social regimentation is not something the novel covers in any great depth. Social regimentation has been largely covered already, and it would seem the only limitation placed on those who do not volunteer for service is the inability to vote. Rico's father is a successful businessman, wealthy enough to send Rico to study business at Harvard, pay for vacations to Mars, and buy his son a Rolls copter. Rico also explains that his friend Carl's parents didn't have anything like the money my father had, While taking leave on a planet called Sanctuary, Rico also notices that the locals work 2 jobs to make a serviceman's leave pleasant. These examples of commercialism and wealth disparity would suggest the free market is alive and well in the Terran Federation. However, the recruiting officer sarcastically mentions the possibility of service including left-handed bottle blowers. So while this particular job seems unlikely to qualify as suitable service, there is a hint here that some industry may fall under the government's control. However, that doesn't necessarily extend beyond current levels, as even the military training is described as having a monetary value. Point 5, the suppression of the opposition, is not offered any real examination in the text. Major Reed, teaching Rico during his officer training, states that complaints are loud and unceasing, so dissent is seen to exist and be tolerated. He goes on to explain that despite the opposition there has never been a revolt, but Reed acknowledges no system is perfect, and each will have its detractors and accusations of tyranny. So, recalling the original definition of fascism, 1. Government headed by a dictatorial leader. No. Rico is a capable person, but is shown to be neither smarter nor more capable than most of his peers. Via his service he will obtain the right to vote in democratic election. The franchise is limited, but that is the case with every democracy mankind has devised. 2. Society is more important than the individual. Yes. While Heinlein's usual individualism is present to an extent, Rico is used to promote a collectivist idea of society, progressing from an unsure youth who signs up to serve for dubious reasons to a young man willing to fight and die for his cause. Strongly nationalist, yes. Often with underpinnings of racial superiority, no. Despite nods to more modern ideas of multiculturalism, this book exists largely to promote patriotism, which Heinlein felt was lacking in the USA of the late 1950s. Accusations of racism would be easily disproved. The text explicitly states all nations and races are welcome in the Federation, and even the arachnids are described as more than competent. Number 4. Economic, commercial and social regimentation. The little evidence that is presented suggests a functioning free market. Individual liberties seem largely unaffected aside from the ultimate right to vote, which is restricted to those who have served the Federation in some capacity. Service is a right available to all. Forcible suppression of opposition, unclear but unlikely. There is no evidence of this, and a little that suggests it is not the case. Whether you decide the book promotes fascism or not will come down to how many of those flags need to be read for you to decide one way or the other. Thank you for listening to me prattle on about Starship Troopers for about 10 minutes.